Okay, so I'm going to go through some very high-level basics on how Unity works and how you put a project together. I'll start with just talking about projects. So the actual project, if I can find my desktop on this machine. Okay. So your project is just a folder tree. There's no project file. There's an assets folder where all your resources, textures, and actual physical assets are. These meta files, everything, they're there for source control. Oh, Unity has a mode. By default, you don't get any of the meta files, and it just does all this binary magic to keep track of what your assets are and information about your assets. So Unity has a mode that you switch on these meta files, and you can actually use source control and share the project a little bit.
They're binary files, aren't they? The meta files, or?
So they're going to go XML or plain text at some point.
No, there's not much information about them. They're just a little ID for it. Other ones like the imported. We get a prefab. We went to an actual texture. That's what we have in here. Then they'll have all you've done for your texture. So they're just ASCII files. There's a mode, you can say ASCII or binary, but obviously the ASCII mode specifically, so it makes it easier to source control our project. So this is what that project looks like when you actually load it up. So basically when you start Unity, you just give it a project folder and that's what you're working on. If you want to change project, you can only have one Unity editor running at once, and it'll actually shut down the entire Unity editor and load it up again under the new project. So now we have a project window where all the assets are. So they're all important windows are inspector window, tells you all the information about your asset, and we've got textures. So if you put a PNG down, then it'll turn up as a texture, and you can just give it all some basic information about the wrap modes and filter modes. We've got shaders. Working anything up on the machine. I think it's just swapping anything. Okay. What I just did. It's just a bit slow. I usually use a much more powerful desktop machine. This laptop's getting a little bit older, but I think that's run right. First I'll show you what the project is when you actually run it. So you hit play, it basically compiles up all your scripts, processes any textures and asset pipeline that it hasn't done already. And eventually it'll come up in the game window. And I haven't actually loaded this in, so that's why nothing happened there. I go back. So scene is a collection of objects. This hierarchy view is what's actually in your scene currently. So by default, I've got no scene selected. It just creates a default camera. I've got this scene view, which is where you do most of your editing to place objects and move them around. So it's basically your level editor. So I actually got a real scene. And I'll put them. Now I've got a bunch of game objects. Everything that you do is just a game object with some scripts attached. So if I click on an object over here, this is one of my scripts. And all these variables are just variables in my script that they use reflection to let you edit them on the screen. And then they've got lots of helpers that you can kind of, if that's a prefab, which is kind of a description of an entity, Then when I click this little button over here, it gives me a list of all the other prefabs in my project, so I can say which prefab I actually want to point to. So for instance, this level test has a little list of prefabs that I'm going to be spawning during the game. I'll get back to showing you what the game actually does first. So you get a bit more context of what we're looking at. Okay, the game is probably running already. Okay. It's not performing greatly on this laptop. Probably doesn't have enough graphics and memory. But basically, lots of little objects, everything that you see moving around, you can actually see them showing the objects in the hierarchy view. So all the little turrets that are on top of these big tanks, mammoth gun turrets. And you get these names are kind of arbitrary, so you can just, when you create an object, like if I dynamically spawn one of these guys and then I create the turret to put on top of it, then I can give it the name to make it obvious what it is down here. It's not actually like a hard-coded class name or anything. All the little fragments. Because this is a tree view, the recommended uses usually you can group things. Like I could make a parent object here that has no transform and then put all the enemies under it. So it just says enemies in this view. To group all these things, which I've done for fragments. Managers, yeah, so under my managers, actually for that. So Unity's kind of, it's just a framework, so you still got to kind of work out how you want to solve your own problems, how you want to organise singletons, or lots of, you can still do managers, or you can try and do lots of little objects that you create from other objects. If this game I've got one manager object, so I've just placed all my managers onto it so I can find them. So I've written a little sound manager script that lets me fire sound effects and reuse sound effect slots so I can have maximum 3 gunshots or 5 walk explosions at once and things like that. But Unity doesn't really, only gives you very low level sound control.
Are all the scripts singletons?
No. I'll go to actually show you some scripts, but you have to actually even write your own script or singleton class and then head it up it by default. I think it's a singleton. So I've got this frag manager class, and all it does is generate all these little fragments. Or just manages the fragments, so when I blow up, when one of the units blows up, see explosions. So all these little fragments around here, and just these things. And close it back, I have to run. Alright, so basically it's this train running around and it's pulling all these little things that have objects on top of each one. There's a projectile class that fires all the bullets, manages all the different types of projectiles. So we'll go back and have a look at how that actually is made up.
So once you stop the game, it just basically resets the hierarchy back to the normal.
Yeah, this hierarchy completely resets, plus anything that you edited resets. So if I was, which can be really annoying for tweaking stuff.
I've done that too, so you change one of your assets to exactly what you want. You go, oh shit, that's the game still running. You hit stop and all your changes are lost.
Yeah, it has this great ability where you can go in here and if I find my health bar manager or something, or say my found you have to pause it if things are moving around. If you create little subdirectives of things then they're all dynamic, then they'll move and you can just close that item so it's not jumping around like it is now. It's only jumping around because I've got these spawning dynamic things at the top level of the hierarchy. And they're reasonably efficient with their hierarchy, so even though there's a transform at every level, so if I create a parent class and then put another object under it, technically I can now move that around like a tree. But if you just keep that identity, it doesn't seem to pay too much. You do lose a little bit of performance just from using the generic framework, but it's not, on PC it's negligible. On iOS you might get to a point where it matters, but not for just categorizing a few things that are really good. Yeah, if you go into the training or something, you could change what kind of tag you've got attached, at least it kind of static loads. I can't really do that, but if I've got too many. Like a collision object, I could change how big the collision is on the. Let's see it. You can see my collision rectangle is changing dynamically. So that's kind of great because you can tweak it and get the size what you want and change the move speeds, but then as soon as you hit stop, as soon as you stop it, it all goes back and undoes everything you did, so you end up having to either write it down, or there's some people who have written plugins that let you cut and paste, and I think in Unity 4 they've actually started doing some cut and paste stuff so you can copy the parameters that you've done at runtime.
There are ways around that as well. I know my new job that they've got a way around that you can edit your data. And
you can extend the editing stuff. Like you can go for any class, you can write your own extension to the editor that saves those information, or you could write it to a file. You could do a dozen little things. But by default, you put an object in there, and you get those parameters, and you change them, and they're gone. So then it's up to you now to write all your ways around it. But Unity's so flexible. There's almost always a solution to the problem, but sometimes you have to still write it yourself. Like everything that you see here, you can extend. What people mostly do with the extension stuff is these properties. Like you can change how everything's viewed here. So if you've got a variable that's a radius, then you can actually write your own renderizer here and draw circles and draw 3 radiuses and all that sort of thing. You do any way you want. There's one price that you pay for it, which I'm pretty sure is related. Is when you're running the script. This UI runs on the same thread as the main script. If you get an infinite loop in your main script, you have to kill the process. You can't break out of infinite loops. So if you do a for loop in your script and forget to increment your variable, you actually got to kill Unity and lose all. And every time you hit play and it runs, it doesn't actually save anything you've done yet. So there's a couple of times now I've been sitting there and then tweak this and then do that and then write some code and then put it in an infinite loop. I tend to use for each for everything that you can from now on, so you just can't get infinite loops too much. So you got to make sure you get everything.
That's the same if your script just crashes if there's some bug.
If the script crashes, you get exceptions. So the exception handle will pretty much capture any crash, but an infinite loop isn't a crash, and there's no concept of breaking into it.
Is this the latest Unity?
It's not running a debugger pointing to another thing. You can put your own breakpoints in, and then when you run it, it'll stop at that breakpoint.
Yeah.
But you can't just break.
So is it the same script that controls the game objects that actually controls the GUI, or is it separate?
It's different scripts. The scripts themselves are just the little CS files, the C# files. Okay, I haven't tried loading up on this machine yet. It's a good one to show. That's the actual script text there, just in a preview mode. And if you double click on a script, and this machine will do it really, really slowly, assuming that it's working, it should be trying to load up the monodevelop. And yeah, there it goes.
What's the monodevelop?
So monodevelop's just basically like Visual Studio, it's just another.
But it's Unity.
Like Unity and all those. Well, Mono is its own thing that they've used as their choice of scripting language. So I think it must be like an open source thing.
Mono is the open source implementation of C# and .NET runtime.
For cross-platform.
Yeah.
Cross-platform C#.
So I think they've modified it a bit. They take the open source in and they customise it a little bit to make it run really nicely with Unity. Because you'll often find that
So you
release has a new version of Mono that's improved this or that.
I can't remember where they host Mono, but you can actually get Mono developed as a standalone.
Mono developed is the
IDE.
IDE.
But this one is Mono develop Unity. I think it comes with Unity, doesn't it? This version.
Yeah. Yes. That's it. It's not the one straight off the source control. It's one that they modified to plug in nicely to their system.
Perfect. I come across bugs with the Mac implementation of Mono times.
Well, this one has been pretty good. That I do what you want there when you go to build settings. Then you can choose what platform you want to run it on. And literally, if I click that and go build and run, if I haven't got the license in this version, but that would, if I was on a Mac, that would be highlighted and I could just go build and run, and then it would appear on my iOS running.
Right.
You do the web player and just go build and run now, and it will
So,
ask me for an output folder.
yeah, what's the work for it? So when you actually build and run, it'll actually deploy it to your iOS device itself?
Yep. It takes ages,
Yeah.
so you definitely wouldn't want to interactively be your only platform is only running iOS, because it builds the Xcode project,
Yeah.
and then it goes and has to build up Xcode, and
Yeah,
it's
okay.
controlling Xcode, and then Xcode does all the signing and everything for you, but it's
Right.
obviously got some integration, so it automates the process.
Does
So
it
can
also,
take a few minutes.
will it also launch it in the iPhone simulator on Mac?
You haven't tried that? It's on the actual device.
Does web player mean run on a web browser?
Yeah,
Yeah, they've got like a...
So they've got, I don't know
Yeah.
if there's native client for C#.
it's not native client, they have their own plugin.
Yeah.
So when you go to that site, it'll ask you for the Unity to download Unity.
Okay.
And so I think that's why they've supported Flash now. So you can also just deploy it straight to Flash.
Right.
And
Because it did say on the web player enable native client support.
Oh,
So I
right.
thought that was just
Okay.
C++.
I haven't looked that one yet, so I have to turn that on and see, try and see if it still needs a plugin.
It could compile the C# out to like C++ using, or like native code using LLVM or something like that.
The C#
It'd be interesting to see how they're doing that.
Well, in the iOS version, all the C# is compiled to C++ to start with. I think you can't deploy the C#. They don't do any JIT or anything on iOS. I'm pretty sure that everything jittered if you do PC and Mac. Like all the C# is jittered. And then the web is using an actual player, so it's just making a big package and the player runs its own shortly. If they're live streaming it or editing it or what they're doing there, it's just really fast. That's all there is for, like inside the scripts you've got all different commands for iOS access of things and anything that's specific to those platforms. But apart from using that just to get like this game up and running with just graphics, I just get playing running, it runs on every platform. It helps that the iOS is shader driven now, so my shadows are run properly on iOS. Alright, so we'll go through some of this, about some components a bit more, I guess. So this game is kind of, it works against Unity. What Unity really likes to do is you place these objects are not real. They're actually just made up of a text file that has boxes and circles and
Yeah,
stuff.
I was going to ask if you're stuck with that, or just end up doing models.
Well, I don't have an artist yet, so I'm still stuck with that.
Right.
But Unity will make it much easier for me to swap them out now. So I've got a dynamic models. That's what I call them.
Oh, okay.
So I've got this executing edit mode, unlike Model Factory. So what that does is all the scripts, you can't use constructors or destructors for your scripts, for your mono behaviors. So that can be a bit of a limitation looking at how you're going to solve your problems.
Why is that?
I think it's just the way they've plugged it into the way they've integrated mono behaviors with the whole thing, because they use a reflection, and they've even admitted they've made a few mistakes that they're kind of stuck with now. But they use reflection to find out which mono behaviors, so mono behavior is basically a component. You have a game object, and then you just put a whole bunch of these scripts, mono behaviors onto the game object. And then when the game runs, every component, every script gets its await function called. So it's a bit like the old MK3 stuff where you get your entities get their init called. And then, so all the awaits get called first, and you can do any basic stuff that you don't know for sure, whatever things.
But that's a
get initialized by that
private.
point.
That's a private method, right? What calls that?
This is part of the integration that they admit that they made a mistake with now, is that they go through the reflection and they find those awaits and they call them. So it just, nothing calls it. Their integration calls it.
Um,
So that's why it's private, even though it's not private at all.
so not intended to be called from other scripts, but it's called by the engine basically.
Yeah, you can call it.
Like,
There's no, I think you get into yourself in trouble because the engine's going to be calling it as well. But, you can just not have them and do your own in it as well. Like with my train that pulls all the carriages, because that's just a big attachment chain now, and the only thing that actually gets its update called is this, these work on the same concept. You get an await called, all the weights of every single object, of every component get called first, and then you get, what's the next one? Startup, I think there's one called startup. That's my attachment system.
Usually
Yeah, you
one
get your start called next. So, and then once your start's called, you get, I think there's even a late start. And then there's the actual update and draw. Actually, there's no draw, there's the update. Because everything's, you don't really have a draw phase. You call draw, and then your object has a mesh. The mesh will get drawn by Unity.
So you attach renderable components rather than explicitly draw.
You actually just attach meshes.
Okay.
All the bullets that you take when I do my own projectiles, and they've got little strips, and all those are drawing. I build each. You can just change the polygons on the mesh dynamically. They kind of optimize that, so that's reasonably fast to do. That does mean copying all the verts across at one point. But, they do have, in the Pro version, they've got some more low-level commands, so you can actually do OpenGL instructions and draw models yourself. It's a bit like, once again, for everybody worked at Chrome, it's a bit like MK3 where you have layers and you can submit models to a layer. But they do it, if you just create the layer, you create the object and they manage all that themselves, but you can do it at another level where you submit the models yourself. So that means if you want to have a model and 3 copies of it, by default you have to create 3 game objects and then put that game object on each of them and then change the output of each of those. I find that it can be a bit painful for special effects.
is mono behavior, that's a Unity class, isn't it? The Unity base class.
Basic class. Anything that you want to attach to a game object.
Any idea why
as
they
a script.
why they didn't call it like base component or something like that?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I haven't read anything as to.
I mean, that's it's adding behaviours to objects.
Yeah.
They are, or each of them is a behaviour, right?
And it's using mono, so I guess they use the word mono just to identify the scripting part of it. Because they have other things, they have other components that they build in which they don't, nothing to do with mono, like mesh renderers and filters and things. But they're still C# objects. Well, they support JavaScript and things, and we'll just say C# when we're talking about scripts. So in my artillery script, in my component I added to, this is actually the projector. This particular script is like a artillery manager. It manages all the artillery pieces that are in the world at a given time. It can talk to the mesh renderer and the mesh. So my artillery script will actually, it's a singleton. Oh, there's only one of them. And then I can't remember if I'm using a singleton, I actually just search for it. People use functions on the projectile artillery to fire projectiles, and then it keeps its own list of projectiles, and then each frame, each update it goes through and it rebuilds the mesh filter, which says the default mesh is none because I'm going to create my one dynamically on the fly. So every frame it looks at all the bullets I've got, it actually just creates the polygons for those bullets and puts them in the mesh filter.
Why is it called filter? Any idea?
Well, that's a mesh filter. Well, they call it mesh render, and I guess that's what. I'm not sure why they just didn't call it mesh, because the actual object's called mesh, but the component's called the mesh filter. I don't really know too much about the philosophies of all the naming standards. I don't know if there's any particular meaning for the word filter.
Does Unity support the physics engine? Wonderful.
It uses physics, it's built in. So it's really for 3D. Like you can do a lot of 2D games coming out for Unity, and there's a lot of 2D plugins that you can get from that people have extended. But out of the box, Unity really sells it 3D. You grab a max object, put it in your assets folder, which I'll load up another projects in 3D in a minute. But as soon as you put a mesh object in there, it kind of automatically creates a physics collision box for it. And you can change that to spheres or whatever physics object. Yeah. As soon as you hit play, everything with a physics object, it's just a physics environment and it all just works. So generally what people do for most of their 3D games is they'll chuck an actor controller in there, which is just a cylinder actor controller in there as a component on one of their objects.
Yeah.
I think you create one of them before. If you create like a sphere or something, it places a game object into your scene and it puts a sphere collision object or physics object on it. So that's actually creating a physics sphere by default. So everything is really, that's the main way that it works, is you just go straight through physics and your game is just a bunch
And
of
what
physics
is it?
objects with the controller.
What does it use as the physics object? Are they expecting you to make a mesh for the physics object, or
No, they're primitives.
do a
If I create a
Convex
sphere,
wrap around?
Yeah, so if you load in your
but you can load in a
Yeah, if you load in a
terrain. You can do a physics terrain
If you
there.
loaded in a mesh like that, a table or something, what would it do as the physics
Well,
shape?
they're not actual meshes, but I think you can load in the importer. Like when you put a max object in, I'll show you on the other project in a minute. When you put a source object in, like a PNG or max, in the inspector, it kind of has all the import options. So it just treats it as all the settings on how you're going to import it and how it can convert it into its own stuff. And I think in there you can say that you want it to actually come in as collision mesh. So I don't think for this one, they're just the basic primitive types.
You can tell it the convex hull too, like, it'll just do a shrink wrap, bounding hole
I
around it.
don't really do much with the physics. Both the projects I've got don't really use physics, so.
There's a rigid body component you can add to it. That's where you put your mass and all this. And the whole hierarchy can deal. So there's joints you can create.
Okay, yeah, vision body, visions, skin color.
You wouldn't want to put too many in your eyes, can you? I guess, right? Well, look at all those particles you've got
Yes,
there.
they
Are they
are.
all simulated yourself or are they physics?
Nothing's physics, well, apart from that it has velocity and gravity. Nothing's using physics for this stuff. Even the push out is just a spherical gridded push out system.
There's another package that I think you included in this project, which is the character controller stuff. It wasn't appearing in when you were putting
No, it's in there.
Is it?
When you add physics as a character controller.
Oh, yeah, yep.
I think that's pretty standard. It was like
What about-
pulled out the physics thing completely.
What about the camera? Does that collide with mesh by default, or do you have to attach
No,
the
their
physics?
camera hasn't got any sort of high level stuff. It's literally, their camera is kind of the whole viewport camera rolled into one. So if you actually click on the camera, a lot of the information about fog and everything, even what kind of skybox, there's a lot of convenient stuff that they've obviously wrapped into the camera to just make it a simpler concept for people to get stuff up and running fast. So all your field of view and projection and fogging and everything, color planes.
You can add a rigid body in there.
Even your output texture, there's all, one camera is pretty much like the whole viewport camera rolled into one.
It's also an audio listener, isn't it?
It's also the listener. There's listeners are separate. By default, when you add a camera, it kind of adds the listener because it figures that you want the camera to be a listener. But that is a separate component that you don't have to have. Attachment system.
And it'll put in like localized sound effects then if you say sound effect coming from that tree, and it'll if it supports stereo,
When you place these sounds, where's my sounds? Resources. It's an interesting thing with resources. They have this bit of a gotcha. It took me a little while to realise is that there's a resources folder. If you want to create assets yourself in code, which I do I'll show you the other project in a minute. Anything under the resources folder gets loaded. Anything that's outside the resources folder kind of only gets loaded if it's referenced. So your default thing is that you add all these assets and PNGs, and then when your game objects actually point to something, then it builds up, and then it knows that you're actually using that texture. So even though I could have a gig of assets, it only actually breaks the package of what's in the scene. But with resources, it's kind of saying to it, I'm going to have code that's going to load that asset later, so make sure that all the resources are always in the package. So because I've done my own sound manager, where I create my own sound assets and play them, manage them myself, my sound's actually in the resources folder.
What do you do if you've got like
all these text files that I want to load myself, but it doesn't know I'm going to load them, because there's just some script that loads them later.
But are they actually only loaded into memory when you load them from code?
Yeah, it's still only loaded into memory, but for say web deployment, the actual package that goes on the website, it's now part of that package.
Right.
So it will download them and it will be sitting there, and then you'll load them out of the package. If you didn't put them into there, then they won't even be on your machine, you wouldn't be able to access them. You just figures that you had them in your project, but you never really use them. There's nothing links to them. So for sound, I'm just going to show you. When you create a sound thing, you say if it's 3D or not. And see, sounds, this is typical sort of importer settings. So for sound, you can say what kind of compression you want to support. That's what I'll call it with August. And you want to compress in memory or stream it when you play it. So fairly high level stuff, but the most common things that people want to do stuff. It doesn't have all the super low level advanced features that we're using, with lots of buses and being able to route buses to different areas and sound occlusion, all that sort of stuff. At this level, it's just literally important to do all the common things for sound. When you do a listener, which I can just delete a listener. You can't add over here or anything. The interface stuff that they're improving. Considering it's 3 years old, it's a little bit surprising, but they're still adding some things that make it a bit nicer to use. The reverb zones aren't used much, but I think they're like just big box areas that when you when the listeners inside that box area, the sound reverb is added to it.
Yeah, so you can
take a
different sound for indoors versus outdoors.
Yeah, it's just very, like a lot of the things are just really high level, a simple version of something that people can get up and prototype really fast. So if you want to have a cave, you stick a big box out of the cave and now the cave has a reverb on it. No more advanced than that, there's no concepts of entering and exiting or worry about a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I found a lot of the time the project you're working on isn't really focusing on audio occlusion or anything like that. It's focusing on something else particularly. So people the audience isn't going to really worry about it.
Most of them don't. Most of the people who get the prototypes up and running, I think a lot of the press it gets from it is just because it is so fast. Because it's simplified, so many of those processes, and don't worry about the really AAA painful stuff that we tend to go through. And most of the users don't really pick up, in my opinion.
Certainly enables lots and lots of developers, doesn't it? Like indie developers.
Well, because everything you're seeing now at the moment is free as well. I'm not using the pro version. I can deploy, because they had a recent deal where they gave away the iOS and the Android basic versions. And the only thing that's up to, like, I can't do render targets and shadows in this version. All the things that make your game look anywhere near sort of a polished art AAA thing they've made in the paid version. But to get a 2D game or a simple game onto an iOS with no render targets, you can do all that for free. And that really drops the entry curve. Even Unreal, you've got to give 25% or something. That's the anything else you want to see from this version?
Even the pro version, is it like $1,000 license or something?
1,500 from scratch.
Yeah.
I think if you have 3.0, because I've got the 3.0 and I got the free version of the iOS, it's about $400 for me to upgrade my iOS to the Pro iOS 4.0s and $1,000 to upgrade to the Pro 4.0.
Unfortunately, you can't get the iOS and Android support for free now, so that's...
Yeah, it was a very short-term deal that you can grab it.
Yeah, if you want to get that now, it's like plus $400 each or something.
Yeah, well, I think if you want to get it, it's not super cheap for people because a lot of these indie games aren't making any money. Like $1,000 is if you're lucky. You're outlaying $3,500 to get Unity, so it's not a walk in the park for just somebody in his garage to just say, I'm going to spend $3,500 so I've got the stuff.
And then upgrade to version 4 and you're going to pay for that.
Well, yeah, now you'd only be buying version 4. You'll be buying version 3 now. I think you can, if you go to their site, they only sell version 4, so maybe try and get version 2 if you want it.
Support's not out yet, though, is it?
No, it's still beta, so I don't know how all that works.
You probably get
They only sell 4, but you can't
upgrade.
actually get it.
Yeah.
Is there anything about the way that game was running that you want to know any more about how that would work in Unity?
Do you have any changes you have to do for your iOS?
No, not one. The whole thing just ran for everything. I use really simple shaders, like my shaders are, you would be able to call them shaders, let's load something up. Look at my shaders. So they've got two levels of doing shaders. If you want to use all the lighting, like it has a deferred lighting model and a forward lighting model, you can switch back and forth from the camera. Another thing with the viewport is the entire lighting graphics pipeline, the camera. So when you go to the camera, you can, hey, plug it in. But it's not turned on. Alright. And it's fine now. Yeah,
So can you do actual like GLSL shaders in the free version? Or is that...
Yeah, rendering path is vertex slid forward or deferred lighting. Generally nothing changes when you turn those, it just all looks the same, and they've got a thing called surface shaders which I haven't played with much yet. If you're doing a proper game, you're just using their system where you put lights down and then you want to change the shaders and you work in the surface shader system. And it's very similar to normal shaders, but I think you just get your inputs and outputs controlled so you can only modify so that all your shader code will work with all the lighting stuff, but I haven't used it, so I don't take it.
So you fill in the blanks rather than write complete custom shaders.
Yeah, I think you've kind of got a very strict set of input and output to it, and then I think the code still is normal shader code, but you have to use their functions to get.
You can't make your own.
So I don't work at that level with this one, I just do complete custom shaders. Because I'm not using their, basically I'm not using their lighting or shadow pipeline. If you want to use their deferred lighting pipeline, anybody's used deferred realize you can't really just write any old shader once you're inside a deferred pipeline.
So you can actually do your own custom shaders in the free version.
Yes, yeah. The only thing you can't do in the free version is you've got a pop-up that says Unity when you breach a game that you can't get rid of, and you can't do render targets. So any effect that you can think of that takes render targets is out of the free version. It hasn't been a big problem on iOS because all those effects kind of end up being a little bit more expensive than you want to spend on iOS. It's a big issue on PC and stuff. I don't think you want to really do a Steam game about a pro version because people kind of expect those effects.
Render guy it works in Ample. There's the render problem with the shaders in it where they had multiple transparencies over top of each other that it just killed the frames per second.
Yeah, you can't do layers of transparency. You can do a couple of layers, and then when they jump to the new iPad with 4 times the pixels, that kills what they were just getting to the point where they were getting some decent throughput, and they just use that up now. So you're back to having no throughput. So here's what their shader stuff looks like. You set at the top your properties, and these are the ones that you can actually edit in the user interface. This is my little outline renderer for everything. The model that I draw has a 3-pass shader. The first pass is a flattened shadow, so it just draws the entire model flat on the ground, black. And the second pass is just colour, because I don't use any textures. And the third pass is the second pass is the normals pushed out, so you get that outline effect. And then the third pass is the colour over the top. So here you can see the first pass. You can see the only thing that I let them specify at the moment is an outline width. and then you get your shadows and some colouring blend options. Your uniforms, which I can actually write to in code. I ran into a big problem with the pipeline recently specific to my game as well. It's when my enemies animate, they skew, they do a little bob, which is really simple matrix. It's just the Y back, you just grab the Y vector and you shift it a little bit and you get a nice little bobbing animation, and but his feet stay nice and flat on the track, but he bobs.
Yeah.
Can't do it in Unity.
Oh, they don't expect you to have a half first
it has its position,
matrix.
a rotation, and a
Right.
scale. And you're going, I can't bob. Which means, and they've got nice hierarchy, and you can, and anything hierarchies are so completely useless to my game because they don't let me skew. So I had to hack all around it, and I don't have the view projection pipe matrix accessible either. They have the model view projection matrix, and you can calculate it yourself by, I'm going to do this matrix. I'm doing this one. Okay. What? You can do it a slow way where you take the model matrix and then subtract it from the MVP matrix, and you've got your VP matrix. Because I need to take the local space vertices, skew those, and then apply my transformation pipeline. And which means I want to take it, apply the model transform so they're in board space, and then skew them, and then apply the MVP or the VP. But I've already applied the M by that point, the local world matrix. So you don't actually get the view times projection matrix. So I pass that up myself in my
Yeah. So the common theme is to do the simple stuff it's simple, but to do the harder
simple
stuff it's
stuff
hard.
is fantastic, and as soon as you want dynamic stuff, the other thing is, I'll show you on the next step hopefully, is a lot of the time you don't just place things around the level and hit play. You want to have spawners and things that spawn enemies, or you want to dynamically generate part of the world, or you want to do all that stuff.
Yeah.
There is nothing, a level editor doesn't help you with that shit. So you tend to write your own level loading system, your own level stuff, and then the editor view is just empty. But this great editor, you can click on things and move them around and change the variables, nothing there, because there's nothing in your level until you hit play. And then if you hit play and it all generates it, you can't modify it, because as soon as you hit stop, everything goes away again. So there is no, you suddenly start losing. You find going from prototyping this particular type of game that's brilliant to doing something that we're more used to doing in a video game. And it might be just an artifact of the type of games I keep doing, are just the worst type.
Or it could be that it's just not suited to Unity.
So it's the worst type for Unity. It's not what Unity likes, the stuff that I've been doing. But it's still nice, because even when I do all this thing that it doesn't like, I still hit one button that deploys to a web and one button that deploys to iOS. So it still sold me on just the fact that you can, once you work around these problems, you can deploy to any platform without messing around. I went to move my engine, and I was saying, oh, now I've got to take my project, I've got to rebuild another Xcode project from the second version of my game, and then I've got to put over the bits, and then I've got to hook up the iOS Objective-C code that is like core, and then the bits in the engine and so forth. So it's just a lot of that stuff, even without like just drawing models and running a shader doesn't bother me too much. It's all the framework around it that they do for you. And the way they've integrated C# is really nice. And if you haven't used C#, you probably should. It's so much nicer than C++. And it's all compiled, it's pretty fast, so it's not like a huge performance thing. I went from my game in the C++ with no object framework, pushing around about 200 enemies at 60 frames a second on the iOS. And this one does about 150, so I've lost a little bit. But,
have you thought about running it in JavaScript instead of C#?
Yeah, but I just had to make a choice of a language. I didn't want to learn them both, and C# is just such useful for work outside of.
There's a big problem with JavaScript under Unity as well. It's not standard JavaScript.
Yeah, it's not.
So you can't go off and read a book on JavaScript and expect to know how to use it in Unity. It looks a lot like it, but it's different in a few key ways.
Yeah, it's not mainly with C#, but I thought, maybe you should go with JavaScript because it's a lot more universal.
Yeah, it's not apparently. They call it Unity script because it's not real JavaScript. It's not Java either. It's just.
Why don't they just go with pure?
They're gonna try and JIT it or have it
end up the same as the C Sharp.
Yeah.
I believe they're using a Java style script style syntax.
I was just going to ask, would you be able to show us how you actually fit that shader into your mesh and configure the uniforms from code?
Yeah.
You can go back to that if you want.
Also, I see that's CG. Have you had any issues with the limitations of CG because it's not GLSL?
Because
Was that not GLSL?
No, it's CG.
I thought CG was there.
no,
That's the thing. Like as far as I know, NVIDIA no longer maintains it to the point where there is no DirectX 11 version. So they still have. I believe they're using it here because they do spit out a multi-platform code. Like it's a tool that works and it actually helps you. But they're not continuing development.
well, not going to see too much there.
And with the OpenGL4, DirectX 11 things have changed a lot. So there's
sort of backward on
tons of changes stuff.
Yeah, this is another project I've done with an artist.
Okay.
It's got public on maps and
Yeah.
there's nobody behind that wall, but we did a little dynamic maze generation algorithm, so I thought I'd just plug it in. But they kind of meant that all the enemies that I placed are now locked up on me in this maze. So we can go to the scene view. So dark, I think there's a brightness in here. That is not it. Mine just got some sort of brightness. Do you know where laptops keep the brightness control?
There should be a hotkey for it, like the function key, and then one of your F keys usually does it.
There's a moon, there's sun up.
Just video image settings.
Okay.
Desktop color might be one, just
Is it
Other-
affecting you?
otherwise
or
you can
affect us?
You can often do it from power options on the tray.
The bed here.
Yeah, but it's
Oh,
again,
I
ratio.
should put it on there.
Look at power options on the tray.
Yeah, my screen's coming up and down, but it's not a big
Yeah,
deal.
it's again, ratio or something like that. You're changing the backlight there, but not the.
Try the bottom, the very bottom one on that list.
That one, yeah.
Mm.
And put up. Yeah,
Try on that.
bring the camera up.
There we go. Okay, I'll do better.
That's what we're doing.
See what the end is looking like.
Yeah.
Multiplying zero by anything.
Oh, there we go.
Better.
Very bright on the screen now, there we go.
Yeah, I can see it now.
Could say you've been inspired by Grimald.
So this one's chugging mainly because I haven't had any visibility calling it a 32 by 32 grid.
Legend Grimald.
Being chased by loudspeakers. That's just a fogging it out when I put it in. If I get the camera. See in my scene, I've got a dynamically generated level that I just put under the level grid so it doesn't populate the entire thing. Every single one of those is an instance of a mesh. I think the cable needs.
Yeah, that's what was happening before. If I touch it, that might get worse. Basically, I place a level object down and then put a level manager script on it. The level manager script job is to actually instance. It creates this level root and places all the instances of the objects into there. And I still don't use their physics for collision though, so no issues.
So does Unity have any sort of level of detail?
It has some text for level of detail, specific text for level of detail, not by default. Like you can model in there. There's nothing on the base model class as level of detail. They have some culling.
They have some culling,
We do
specific
trust
culling
them,
features
culling.
and things that you can put in, but I don't think even those look straight to the level of detail. I think there was something for level of detail that you can use, but I haven't had any expense of it.
But they probably give trust in the colour to get objects.
You get all custom colour everything by default, and that's reasonably fast. Because even though I'm drawing that entire thing from any angle through all there, it's still runs at 60 on my PC. The colour must be reasonably fast. Plus the graphics cards are just so fast these days, it doesn't affect. It takes a lot to slow them down. And even that, without any colouring, runs quite about 15 frames a second on an iPad. And I assume if I actually trace forward and just drew the things around the character that you could see. You can see there's those skeletons walking around. Yeah.
Have you played with the colouring?
Pause and no, I haven't played the colouring myself yet.
I had a go at it a while back and I sort of abandoned my attempts at it at the time. It was like making things disappear when they shouldn't be.
Not really. Is it there, what their colouring features?
Yeah, it takes a long time to bake out the grid.
You got the Pro version?
Yeah.
All the colouring's only in Pro as well. For this game it was just going to actually trace its own colouring. Because you're just a person in the grid here, so I can just trace out.
You don't know if you're generating that anyway, don't you? So.
It's good for me to trace through and know what things are visible or not, and use a really generic colouring up on
So if it has a PDS generator, the collision generation thing. Conjugates, potentially this.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And you've got to bake it all so which cell moves.
Yeah, and here you've got these are the shader variables. So in their shader, this is one of the default shaders, specular. In their shader, this is actually specular. Let's step back to iOS settings. So they'll have their properties at the top of the shader saying that they've got a colour, couple of colours and shininess and the base. I have problems with these because if I want a second one that uses the same variables but they just give me a slider with no numbers and there's no colour base feature or anything to move these values. I think Bruno showed me a way to do it and then I've since forgotten how to do it again, so I don't think it's very intuitive how you do it. And then by default they've got a texture matrix on everything. I put all those out on my game just to streamline all through iOS. So for my object that you place down on the screen, no, that's interesting. I've actually placed an animation. Yeah, so should mention how this stuff's done because that goes into prefabs. So this is little range generated scripts. You go to what my level builder does is it has a text file which it loads up, which will be under resources level. So I've basically got that. I'm not using that at the moment because it's using this generator algorithm instead. But what I used to do is just goes through there and it finds, based on the ASCII code, it just puts down what how much in a nicer editor than that, and you can actually see it laid out non-proportional. Now it's quite fast for just prototyping different paths and things with level. Faster than any sort of level editor, people are working the level editor.
Is that your own sort of custom config format, or?
Yeah, it's not a shape format, just like a hierarchical ASCII format. Every node just has a list of values and then another node. Just experimenting with it's very similar to YAML.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking, it looks like that.
Well, actually, when I'm editing this in Notepad++, I use the YAML syntax thing in it, and it does all the folding and everything for it.
Yeah.
I was just experimenting with making more readable formats and just getting rid of everything out of the entire format. So you've just got this completely bare basic. So you just
Very clean, yeah.
literally. I mean, because it doesn't use any special codes, you can put slashes and everything into here, and it doesn't care. Yeah, or spaces, because it's only time I have to use quotes is if I put a comma inside the parameter. Because each of these can actually be a list of items. But then there's no structure other than you've just got a node, and then the node has children, and the children are children. And nothing else, there's no attributes or...
Does it use the indent to know that it's a sub?
Yeah, the indent is like in YAML and Python, the indent is the scope.
Two spaces.
It doesn't matter what the indent is, you can choose what it is. It just has to be the same as the previous line. So
Makes sense.
it's just a little bit scary because it's scary because so many fucking editors mix up tabs and spaces. Now if you use Notepad++ and you set it to YAML mode, it'll actually make the line red if you mix them, because it must be a big thing with anybody. I was a bit worried about that whole thing until I found out Python and YAML both use the same technique. Not that I will don't be complaining too much about Python. It probably isn't as scary as it sounds like. It just gets rid of all formatting brackets and things, and semicolons and all that stuff. And it's so ridiculously simple to file.
Do you parse it yourself or are you using a library?
No, I pass it myself, so I invented it. There's any library out for it. It's even small. It's even, I was looking at YAML because YAML was a nice attempt at something more readable, but it's like a super set of JSON. It's massive. It's like I just want some really it's easy to do that.
I was thinking you probably could use a YAML parser to read that.
Yeah, no, it's a really small parser, and then the code for actually loading in level. Which I'm not sure if I've done the right way because a lot of with Unity. It's kind of data-driven, but when you use it, it doesn't really feel data-driven because everything in data is a reflection of the code. So if you go and change your variables in the code, you can lose all your data. You can have all these prefabs. So if I want to place down one of those blocks, I can put all decorations on it, and then I save it as a prefab, which
There's this whole kind of metal linkage, isn't it, between code and...
yeah, it's really tightly linked. So even though it's all data here and it's all data on the disk and you can edit it and it's a nice editor interface, it's completely linked to the code variables. So if you change your code variable, you lose all your data. Or if you change it the wrong way, you lose all your data. I said that when I first found out about it to one of the artist friends, and then a couple of days later he was freaking out because he just lost all his data because he actually changed one of his. I think, yeah, I thought that might happen once in a while, but it seems a bit dangerous to me. So it made me feel like it's not quite data-driven, it's more like code-assisted, editor-assisted hard coding.
I think you've got to sort of consider the code as data. Like that's the way it feels to me.
Yeah, but when you do coding, and then I prototype, and then I go, okay, I have a better idea of how I want to structure that code, so I break it into this way, and I break it up that way, and then I go, I can't. If I do that, I lose all the prefabs and everything I've done. You can't clean up you can't maintain your code. I find that a bit nasty. Like normally I do a level file, yeah, I have to write a parser, but I can change the level data, I can change the code, as long as the parser works, it links together. With this reflection stuff, you don't have to do anything, it all just magically works, but you've just got this little fear sometimes when you're writing your code, if you accidentally delete your variable or something and then don't pick it up early enough in the pipeline that you haven't lost your data, you just lose everything that variable was set to.
Yeah, it's kind of very seductive convenience, but then it doesn't really scale, eh?
A lot of the stuff, yeah, I wonder how much it scales, but it doesn't become an issue because people don't scale it, they use it for small projects. I've seen someone was talking about doing big projects, and not only does Unity, they were complaining that Unity just crashes on a really big project, and they've gone through and they've split it into 4 smaller projects, and they've dynamically linked across here and there, and they still wanted to use Unity, but they found a way to make it work for them. So, the indie projects, 5-man teams with mainly one programmer, and because it's so fast, it gets up and running, you may only need the one programmer and just have artists putting stuff in, and it's offset. It's offset by the fact that you can deploy on every platform and get so much stuff down. So what was I trying to show you?
I think the philosophy is that you make like 5 quicker games instead of making...
Yeah.
You start making one game, I think Unity is really good, I'll just make it even better and better and better. You just make 5 smaller.
Well, I think because of the component, like when I went from Train Defense, which is just my own thing, and using Uber classes and all this stuff, and then I had to port it all to Unity, everything just looked so much neater. Partly because it's the second time and I already knew how it had to code, but also because it's components, you have to think more about how you're going to break up and how you're going to solve these problems. In C++, you can just say, I don't want to think about it too much, I'm just going to get it to work. In Unity, you really have to think, okay, I've got these things, they have to be separate, how do I communicate between them?
How do I get this one to talk to that one?
How do you communicate in Unity between scripts? Or between
If it's on the
objects?
same object, then you can find it. There's a function that will get you a class. So if I've got, the transform, for instance, that's an actual component. So you can say, and you can use all the C# just properties and things, so it doesn't look like you're doing finds, but and they do that. It's really nasty because the first thing you find out is when you say transform.position equals whatever, it's really slow. You don't know it's really slow. You think you've just got this matrix and you're setting the position on it until someone says, "Oh, you don't do that. Make sure you cache it." So at the top of every monitor behavior, they go, "My transform equals transform. My thing equals this," and it's just copying all the get components across into a C# pointer. So everything's kind of a pointer in C#.
But what if it's a different object completely?
Then you can
communicate with.
You have to problem solve a little bit yourself. You've got lots of tools in there. You can find objects by tags, you can find objects by name, you can find objects by type. You can find anything that has a particular type of script on it. So if I have a singleton, I can actually just say find me that singleton and it will find me that class. They're all going to have speed things, so you kind of want to, anytime you're finding something, you kind of want to cache it if you can in that component. And the rest of it's up to you to problem solve how you best want to structure that. There's also callbacks, like a lot of people do event systems where you just register that you want to be told about some event with some central thing.
I've been shifting all of the code to the singletons because of that, because in the start I had so many fine components, just picking up different parts of the whole thing.
Yeah, still, I love singletons until I go into the forum and people keep telling me not to use them, and then I use them and go, and then I use them again. I just don't run into the problems that they keep saying. Every time I try not to use singletons and try and pass all the information down everywhere, it just becomes a mess of information you're passing. No, I just have one sound manager. I don't need to have my interfaces with sound manager as a parameter because I want to avoid a singleton. So
You do need access to globally access, don't you?
I think you just have to, you make a few design decisions that you will have these and you don't make really stupid ones. Like one game we're on and someone decided the player profile was a singleton on an Xbox. Yeah, if you have really stupid design decisions, they don't usually hurt you too badly. And that person's running around going how bad singletons are, going, no, I think it's because you decided that there was only one player profile on an Xbox. Might have been the real problem there.
Not going to mention any names, is it?
Might have had somebody with game room. Prefabs are a very important concept. Prefabs are like if I place, and the other thing prefab is a little bit interesting is you kind of put an object into the level, like that's an enemy prefab, that's my skeleton. I'll show you the ones I really use in this one at the. Where do I have my prefabs? No, there's the measures.
Remember the name of it? Just type in the search thing.
I'm pretty sure. What they're in the resources thing. They have to be in resources because those are just one enough. They have to be in there. Maybe it is the. Oh, that's a prefab. No prefabs. Can't be found. But anyway, you. Prefabs. Like for my mammoth tank that I spawn, in my code will just say instantiate a mammoth tank, which I have a pointer to the prefab of. So in here, enemies. So I've got a bunch of enemies that I can spawn. This little square means it's a prefab. So what would have happened here is I would have placed a game object into the scene view, and then I'm going to add some AI to it to say that it's going to be a thief. As these guys just go up and they try and, well, it's got the wrong AI, but it's, the thief AI just goes up and tries to steal water from the tower in the centre. A dynamic model script says that I'm going to use the mammoth model for my text file or dynamic models. So when that one runs, it actually creates the mesh object and sticks it onto my mesh builder. The propulsion system that I'm going to use is just a ground wheel type with a bunch of speeds. And these two are just so that I can draw it. Push out object, I give it, it's basically my version of physics collision. I just give them a radius and say that, give it like a group that define who it's going to push out against, and whether or not it actually pushes out or not. Then the attached list is another one of my scripts which says that on my dynamic models I have a bunch of reference points that I can attach items to, named reference points. So in my attached list I've got one attachment, it's on the turret attachment point, and it's another prefab. So when this attached list runs, it will actually create instantiate another object, which is the mammoth gun prefab. So when I click on here, you can say, oh, I'd rather have a falcon blades on top, or I might want a flamer turret or whatever. So I can change what kind of turret is going to be on that particular prefab. So, and then my health object is how my it's kind of the hit points with all the armor and different types of kind of damage values. It's just hit points. In this version, I'm going to have different types of armor. So I've just put that into a meta health script that does all the maths on that. So when it takes damage, it just sends it. It gets the point to the health object and tells it to take damage of a particular type and does all the calculations. It blows up kills the entire thing if it runs out of health. So once I've done all that in this view, and normally that's sitting here in the world, has no model because of my super dynamic model thing. Normally that would be a mesh and you would see all tab there in a simpler game. Or game. It's a bit happy with Unity.
Maybe you should go through the process of code and prefab with an existing mesh. Maybe go through the process of code.
Again, we go to create an empty game object. So that gives me just something in space. I can click on and move around. Changes all the little values. And you just have to keep going through one by one and give it some AI. And all of my scripts do this one thing. I know how that's supposed to scale when I've got 10 pages of script. There's no subvectors or anything for these scripts. It's just a big flat list. And it's basically largely looks like. So I'm going to give it a model. I'll give it a mesh name.
So
I
has
can't
it-
link these up yet. I have to write my own editor extension to be able to link it to something. So I have to kind of know the names of the models from the.
Those variables you got there, whatever the max radius, are those like global variables and scripts just pulls automatically out, or how do you know which variables show up in there?
Yeah.
So have you got an automatic dependency from use dynamic model to mesh builder? Is that set up in the script or something?
I think I do. I was playing with the automatic dependencies at one point. I've made a couple of them. And I read some forum articles about whether or not they thought they were a good idea. I changed mine a couple of times. Yeah, I think my dynamic model has. No. No, it's not. It's the actual model. Used dynamic models, but yeah, so it's got to require a component.
Right.
Say that it wants a mesh filter. So when you add that, it will automatically add the mesh filter for you.
It won't let you get rid of the mesh filter either.
The execute and edit mode is supposed to make it so that you can actually see it in this view. Which isn't working at the moment. It's not too far away, isn't it? It's just a bit flaky with the order of operations. Yeah, so all that guy does is hide the inspector, anything that's public, and I've made a lot of things public, just so that other things can find it.
So is all the stuff in square brackets Unity commands?
Well, there's C# attributes. That Unity has its own C# attributes. So you can have like system ones. And like non-serial, you can tell things not to serialize because serializations, you don't have to use your own file format. Serialization is kind of built into C#, so you can just serialize a class. I've got a lot of experience with that yet. That gets you back to being really tied in with the code and data. So I'm still not sure I really like that much. But
They're included in the reflection information, so you can make your own attributes and like attach them to functions and classes. And then when you're reading back the reflection information, you can get all that data back and whatever parameters you pass to the attributes and whatnot.
and it applies to like the next variable. I'm not sure how the scoping rules are. Like these apply just to that class. This, like I put them on the same line, but most of the time you see that the people put them on the second line like that. But it just gets really ugly when you have quite a lot of them. It just applies to, you have to put that in front of every single public variable you've got if you don't want people to edit it, but you still want your classes to be able to access it.
What's the name of your push out object?
Yeah, I've got people all over the place now. But, so when you're waking up, I find that I'm just using an old style instance system there, so I just ask the dynamic model instance to find me that mesh that they've typed in there. So that's a public one with no hide, so that will actually be editable. So I can just look for it. I can do a debug log if I didn't find it. The exception handler kind of handles most of our cases, so you don't have to worry too much about anything unless you really want to survive it. But if you just want to know that something's gone wrong, then the exception handler will pick it up for you and the log can just give you some more. So.
Is that debug.log? Is that something that comes with Unity or is that your own system?
No, I think it's that's Unity. That's their little log window. I think they call it console.
Okay.
So everything that you write there, like all these null references that are going off in my game at the moment.
I can't see it.
I'm usually meaning that. Oh, and actually, it's a little red down the bottom here. It'll just tell you one. And normally when you run that should be nice and clean. I've just copied this project across and never used it for a month. And quite likely that's probably why you're not seeing the tank when I just hooked it up. And I've set something up to the wrong name or something. Because it's just, see, normally they're all links and they're fine. It's just this one case where I need to come up with a nice structure where I can read that file into some sort of singleton and then use an editor extension to give me a drop-down list of what the actual options are. At the moment, you have to go into the models file and without syntax highlighting, find the model that you want to. I'll probably split it into lots of little files or something. I'm still learning how to make things a bit more usable in some areas. By the way of doing it anyway.
But it's not
one of
working.
gizmos is for extending stuff. So this is just editor stuff. And it means when the gizmos, when the debug drawing stuff happens up here, I do the unput. I draw like the collision radiuses and things like that in the, so they'll appear in the edit window, they don't appear in the game window. So you can do your own edit window type stuff. And people have actually, who know what they're doing, have customized whole editors into those edit windows where you can have like little animation bars and draw actual level editors where they can lay out paths and things and set an interface to it. So you can extend it. I think pretty much anything you see that they're doing in Unity, you could pretty much do yourself. A bit of effort.
Is it most editor written in?
Yeah, so,
Please.
I think the big downside is that they're just using the one big thread for it all, so then there's no complexity with multi-threading or when this editor stuff runs versus that stuff runs. Your whole game just kind of runs in the editor and your game at the same time. Well, once you deploy it, it's not a performance issue, it's just an editing issue.
Are they fixing anything like that in Unity 4?
I haven't heard of anything to do with that particular piece. I think it's fundamental to their entire structure. Unless they can run another thread that can break into this thread or something and stop your script from getting infinite loop. I think it's their actual main thread is stopped. It's just so used to running in Visual Studio, where Visual Studio is not running your code, it's just connecting to it, so it can break it. So it's a real shock to the system to find an infinite loop is an issue. So you just, in C# it's not as big a deal because you tend to use for eaches and
language constructs that don't cause that issue all the time. It's just when you ever touch your for loops or your while loops, it's so easy to forget the iterator. I literally do 99% of my stuff now just using for each, and it just, the code just gets cleaner and everything's nicer and you don't run into those problems.
We're due to get kicked out in about 10 minutes if the next speaker turn up, so I might want to start wrapping it up.
Yeah, well, that's a prefab. We've created all that thing and then we can just drag them across. Now, there's a piece of code there that you can just call, you can declare a variable called a mesh filter. Oh, what's this? I'll go to the attachment thing for the code. Attachment script. Yeah, so the attachment system, it's just an array. So it appears in Unity as there's an attached list. There's no little array, but actually, like you can't. There's no add or subtract stuff. You just say, I want three items, and it creates 3 items, and then you say what the 3 are, and then that gets into the code here. So now if I the init. So this init I call myself because I control the initialization of attached lists, because it's just so important that the order of everything running, because everything has to spawn everything else. And the one thing I've run into quite a lot when I was trying to implement this, and it took me about 3 or 4 iterations, is just every script's just there, and you've got all these objects, and you've just got all these scripts, and they're all just going to get wait called. You have no idea what order they're going to get called in. And then they're going to get the start called. And even worse, when I call instantiate, which is here, so that creates a new game object. It basically clones that prefab and makes an instance of it. And it calls the await straight away, but for some reason, start is called next frame. So that object actually runs its update and draw. I don't think everyone's updated. Everything else runs their update with that object existing, but it hasn't had a start called. So it hasn't really been initialized. So you know, try and get everything into a wait, or pretty much if you want to spawn anything, if you want to go in spawn pools, because we've got garbage collection now under C#, you can think about, if I just want to keep creating everything in bullets and things on the fly, my game might suddenly glitch all the time from garbage collection, so a lot of people just say, well, we'll just have our spawn pools. And I've got that for a few things, I haven't for everything yet, but if I start getting hit by garbage collection, everything will be going straight to a spawn pool.
Yeah, we found that slowed down our game analysis quite a lot.
Yeah, everybody's spoken to being hit by it.
Pre-allocated, when you loaded it up.
I haven't been hit by it yet, but I'm expecting the garbage collection to hit me at some point.
Yeah.
But, to do that then you kind of control your own start and wake up and everything. You don't use their system then, you just spawn all these older items, you set them there and you call and you just write your own init files and things. So it's not a reason you want using constructors and D# just for the actual mono behavior objects. All your other C# fine, that's fine, you can just use anything you want, normal C# stuff. Apparently it doesn't support namespaces as well, so anybody who really likes namespaces might get a bit of a shock there. Because there's a physics system I wanted to use, I said I've still namespaces, so you can't.
But don't you have to use namespaces in C# anyway?
No?
Is that class not in a namespace?
No, namespace, the actual keyword namespace, like making arbitrary namespaces. I don't use them much, but apparently there's a physics engine called FreeSpace, which is quite nice. It's like a C# version of Box 2D. But they said they couldn't use it because it's all using namespaces, so people have to actually port that to get it working.
Yeah, it relates something to their Unity reflection model to expose up the editor.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still using namespaces, but you can't make your own.
Yeah, I get the feeling that like when they very first started, they just made a few learning curve errors, and so they got a pretty robust start, but they made a few things with the way they've used reflection to get call functions and things that they've regretted, but they've got such a user base now, there's not much they can do to break everything to.
There's also technical issues just with the way, I mean, mono being the type of C# implementation it is. There's not easy solutions around it.
Mm.
Anyway, so up there, you declare what is that? Fine attachment. Okay, so that's finding another
was talking about before, if you want to find something else. So on the new, I spawn a new, like this is my tank spawning its turret. So it'll spawn the turret, and it's now got this turret as a new game object. And then it can find the attachable object. This is another script that I put on it. And that allows, it's like the binding script that lets the two point to each other. So it finds that attachable thing, and then it pulls the on spawn, which will then, it's like the init thing, so you can then pull its attachment, this spawn tree.
As an ex-Chrome person, you would have used, level editors and development tools in the past. How does Unity compare to what you used to use or what you've seen, even if you didn't use it all?
It's very good. Like, it's very solid and it's fast and simple.
Is it also quite recognisable? Like, yeah, we used to do that, and that's
It's very intuitive.
like we used to have property windows or.
Well, if you use Macs and stuff a lot more than even editor windows, it's just got your movement modes up here. You've just got your scene that you're placing objects down, moving them about, and it all just kind of works. And it's nicely extendable. It was pretty easy to add collision objects around the objects that I wanted to see with the on-use most things. It's got a demo, it's got an GUI call, so you can put your own GUI system on. It's got a really weird GUI system I've never seen before called immediate GUI, which they're changing because most people I think have the same impression that it was worth showing you. You basically have it, you just say if, and then you describe the button, and then you do the code. So you say if this square rectangle with this texture is pressed, then do the code. There's no instance of the buttons or anything.
Or it just creates a button because you've said if.
Yeah.
Every frame.
But it does
It runs pretty slowly.
Yeah. Well, speed is one of the things that people complain about it.
Does Unity include speed tree? I thought we had that somewhere.
I think I couldn't tell you. I think so. I haven't used it. It rings a bell, but
well, I thought that it was like quite fast when you do levels because you can just like stick trees in and stuff. Yeah.
But you can do that with any meshes. So any meshes you can paint down on the terrain.
There's also like buttons for.
it doesn't have like a paint mode editor though, really. Like everything you place down is a create object. It's not like a.
I'm just reading a book on it, and they're talking about painting on the terrain. You can paint. There's basically painting trees, but that's actually really just any mesh, I think. And then there's painting detail, which is like grass and foliage.
I think that might be in a terrain editor extension. I don't think that's not just placing your normal instances down. I think that's probably a normal terrain editor extension to it. Because it doesn't even have, like, you don't have access to instant height map editing terrain stuff by default.
It's in there, isn't
It's
it?
a thing you can add to it.
It's definitely in this book I'm reading.
I've created terrains with, like if you
There's a
place
terrain button up
trees
there.
down, you can push up, push down, do all your layers, and flat maps. There's a,
It's in this thing.
there's also buttons for saying I want to cover the entire terrain with trees and set all the density.
Yeah,
and-
okay. You
Right.
look at this thing.
Okay.
So it does have a height map. You know, I just said,
Like trees, doesn't it?
that you can paint trees and things like that. So I don't know how to use it, I haven't used it. So.
See where it says no trees defined? I think you can basically, if you
It's a full paint thing on a height map.
That's cool.
Yeah, if you go to the tree button, and then there's an add.
or edit.
Yeah, add
Trees.
a tree. And there's some default ones which come with Unity. If you need to make sure that there's tree packages you can.
Okay. No, I haven't used any of this part of it, so.
Yeah.
And,
built-in.
There's also tree graders, which I'm sort of working with a bit. And initially they look really ugly, but I looked into it. I spent a few days going through it, and if you just basically take a little bit of time to look at real trees, and you work out, how many branches they split off and how often they do it, and the pattern they do it, you actually algorithmically generate, gum trees and stuff.
Well, it's a little editor to say
Yeah.
the parameters.
I'll go out and take photographs of bark and leaves and stuff, and turn it into alpha maps and stuff. And they've got random seeds too, so like it's not quite at the same height or the same rotation or whatever. So you can just have thousands of the one tree design. And
That's part of Unity, is it?
yeah, and they all fit into their wind system too, so they will move and sway
Oh,
with the
wow.
wind.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I've
touch on, most of the things I've got in there is with physics, and then one of the default level is like a FPS with a terrain that you run around in.
All the trees LED as well. I mean, sometimes the LED a bit too. They need to tweak when it changes. You can see the trees are morphing again.
What's the best showcase game on Unity at the moment? Like, what's the most impressive thing anyone's made? Really
The
show
ones
off.
that they
Wasn't Battles Take Life?
what
You
do
know,
they give you a
the online one.
I think it was. Is that impressive though?
Oh, you know. It's published.
This is the latest sort of show of tech and stuff that they've got based on the training on. And now they're running this machine.
They had an island demo. It's an old one, but
Yeah. Basically what they've released on the iOS, so it's still more of an iOS tech, doable on iOS tech versus doable on PC tech's a bit different.
The biggest growth market.
Yeah.
they've got like a soldier wandering through a forest.
It's a bit like an Alien Green game.
Oh, yes, yes.
And that runs at 30 FPS on an iOS device. That's a little environmental effects and all.
I think I've got that on my phone.
So you can actually download this from the App Store.
Yep, I suppose we get.
So using a mouse and keyboard now, it's designed for iOS. Does it have like a different control?
You've got network somewhere, have to have a no, I don't find it.
Yeah.
I don't know what the main character is. He's just a captain. Controller, spawn upper, first step and this is for sandbox. It's kind of cool. Like once you get into it, it's just so refreshing having a component system that you're building up your character, and the way you build it up, it just naturally works for reuse. You're really quite conscious of everything you put into there, where you're searching for other components and things, and you know at each point, or if every time I have to search for another component, I'm making this less usable or less reusable. So you do end up reasonably reusable components, like it's encouraging you to do it.
Something about joystick there, the move control.
They've got a pre-baked lighting global illumination system in there. Takes a long time to run. But it's a third-party one from Beast.
Yeah, that's official.
If you turn up all the options, it can take days to bake the lighting for once. I've started looking into pre-baking in Max and taking it through Unity. The Unity thinks it's its own shadows, but it isn't. It's the ones that pre-baked using their own. So.
The latest Mac testing typically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, mental rays.
Yeah. What do you call it?
It's joystick on the
Just poor old being single core.
Applications and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Because it's there's no way you can do one of those effects as well. And Unity comes with another component you can chuck on the camera, just screen space and the occlusion, and it really improves the quality of the.
Oh, these
I think it was running there.
Yeah. Nothing for that.
Or probably the most call it crease highlight.
Yeah. The old filter.
Pretty dark shadow around that hose on the ground there. But it is effective, it creates a volume effect.
Definition that's very flexible. So you can get keys and an access.
But a lot of those are full screen
And ways of
effects.
how they
Oh,
map that
it's
to a virtual pad on the Xbox. I don't know. I think they have a concept of a virtual pack somewhere in there,
Yeah.
buried in there. They actually provide you with a few types of virtual pack that you can just plug in and set a normal joystick. I don't see it there. I'm pretty sure it's in there somewhere.
Do you play around with that master server stuff? You know, the networked lobby service? I've started vaguely looking at it a bit. But they've got this system where you can connect to other games through firewalls and stuff. So it's like you sort of register your server with their server, and everyone else looks at that server.
Okay, matchmaking as well.
Yeah.
Unity's got a matchmaking server running.
Yeah, it's not. It's just more for you publishing where your matchmaking server is. You know what I mean? So, and for people who are running their clients behind corporate firewalls or whatever. So
Does it rain?
It's funny.
Little rain boxes everywhere. So it's interesting how people come up with their how do I get rain from not going inside the building solution.
I think Unreal's better for first-person shooters,
Is that?
but you know that's what it's specialised for.
It probably gives you a good leg up because from what I hear, most of the scripts have already built around them first-person shooters. So if you're not doing first-person shooter, you can have to fight the fact that they've got all these first-person shooter variables that you have to deal with.
Yeah, I wouldn't really want to compete with first-person shooter market myself.
I find tough on Unreal because they always have such good art, so it's really easy to think that they're better.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that the engine side is better, it's just that they always seem to have fantastic art coupled in there. And maybe there's some things that they're doing in the pipeline that's making the art look nicer, but hard to say.
You need to measure how quickly you could achieve some content creation process and how much fun it was. Did you want to kill yourself at the end of the process?
First-person shooter is one of the things this thing will do really well because it's just a player capture running around physics collision. So you just chuck that in, you'll have a first-person shooter running in a day, really.
That's one of the. I mean, it's also the cost as well, so it's really attractive for you. It's like if you're going to sell more than 50 grand's worth of product, and you're on iOS using Unreal, it's like Apple take 30% or whatever. If you and after that 30%, so let's say you make 80 grand, 30% of that would get you down just above 50 grand. You've got to pay Unreal 25% of whatever your income is, not yet.
Yeah, 25%.
So down,
but I think it just scares people off, even though nobody would imagine.
Nobody
nothing
does
but
so
people.
50 grand.
It just seems like I'd like it to have a limit. Like I don't want to have to deal with just the accountancy of having to owe them 25% forever. You just want to break your ties with them and say, I just want to own this now, maybe for the first year or something. But for the entire lifespan of it, I've got to keep the accountancy sorted out so I can always give you 25% of everything I make. If you do like loft thing, is that just restricted to that exact format of that app, or?
No, they give you the option to buy the engine for that title, for that SKU, and you don't have to pay the 25%, but it's 6 figures.
100,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
So by the time you've got like 3 SKUs, into 7 figures.
Yeah, so it's interesting, but it's like from the point of view that it's actually no money to get into it and get your app onto the App Store. But
That's a target.
well, then even though Crytek's got a really good game on the App Store, so their iOS engine was reasonably good.
What's their business model these days?
I think I don't know, they're looking towards free to play the actual game side of things, but I don't know what the engine is. I don't know what costs to get into it.
But they're showing the engine off, like just like an AI demonstration, like how to give an area for where the attractors can go. It was like going back to generated or something, like a terrain.
Well, Crytek and Unreal seem to be masters of demoing their engine.
Yeah.
They always make it look fantastic when you demo it, but then you talk to anybody that can use Unreal and pretty mixed stories. I've never used it, so I can't say too much. I've touched it a little bit, but the visual side of it was a bit of a learning curve for me.
So the big conclusion, are you going to use
I'm gonna use
Unity
it.
again on future games?
Yeah, even 2D stuff is not really built for 2D, but I mean, just the deployment side of it just wins out over everything. And C#, once you start using C#, you don't really want to go back to C++.
Yeah. I've heard that C# can often be faster than C++, even with its own memory management, because C++ you've got to compile it for a type of machine, but you don't compile it for the specific machine that you've got, whereas C++ can actually, you can know if it's doing like just in
That's
time.
the GIF stuff, but that's not going to be on the OS. Because that's still going to be compiled as best.
There's specific cases where that's correctly saying legacy compiled C code may not be as fast as jittered
on PC or something.
Or
like
a case where you got a lot of mutex reference counting in C, where garbage collection would eliminate that need to lock regularly.
Yeah, I think that might be comparing people who use the auto smart pointers a lot with garbage collection versus people who just don't use any of that. It's probably a lot faster still. I don't know. Like, don't have many. Most of my C++ code doesn't have memory management other than when you have to delete it at the end of ending the game. So it's not faster than that. Oh, it just depends on what you're doing.
It's features
You're not
of how you
upgrading,
use
like
it.
if you're using cold stuff a lot, you kind of eliminate memory management completely. Once you start going back onto threads, then you sort of slowly get to have to deal with stuff.
Tom, give me a quick look at the profile.
The profile up.
You can see the spikes in the garbage
I've never
collection.
used it.
Come
I
on.
mean, there's the one page thing that comes up.
Yeah.
So,
Did you use coroutines at all, or fibers or something like that in your C# code?
no, I looked at coroutines, but I tend to use state machines more than
That's fair.
coroutines. And it seems to be one of the others generally. You don't use them too much.
Yeah.
But
You may not
the
have one
computing
where you really want to do
technologies-
this and that, then like, you know.
Like my AI
that'd be
systems
the
still
need.
tend to be state machines versus coroutines.
So the downside of like something like Unreal, because you've got this scripting language, but you're still dealing with ticks rather than really having a coroutine threading effect. That's sort of a big value of
So
some
I
of these
think that's
scripts.
the only profile you get
Oh, is it?
on
Okay.
on the normal. I think you need Croak or anything else.
Yeah, you get all the big sort of chart, with where it's the spikes and drops.
Where is that? Where's that accessible? I've never seen that.
It's one of the windows.
Little drop down thing there, little arrow, is it in there? Yeah.
And that's just with these photos.
On the window or tools menu, I think.
Lets you isolate expensive code or objects.
It's all hierarchical. I mean, it's not as good as some of the third-party commercial ones. I used VTune years ago, which had a bit more depth to it. Is there anything underneath the window? Profile. Yeah, but it's disabled, as you probably know.
Probably an advanced thing.
Pro version.
Yeah,
Paid-
pro version. Yeah. But it works on iOS and everything else. But, I mean, it's pretty high level. You can see the functions, and you can take snapshots. And analyze it afterwards.
They put a lot of thought into what they put into Pro versus the basic. So the basic is completely functional and usable and not a prototyping thing, but you want to do stuff really seriously, you're just constantly hitting walls against. I really like that.
The main reason I bought the Pro is because it was deploying the web, and with the free one, you always get powered by Unity on top of any thing you do.
Yeah, despite all those other features, powered by Unity is still
Yeah.
the biggest driving one that makes you want to buy the Pro version.
Could act.
Is it 1 o'clock already? Was that fun?
Just a little bit past.
Well, thanks, James. That's
Yeah, thanks very much.
Wait a few more minutes,
So
and
you
might
guys
be able to grab the
switching
next session as well.
Is that user for everything?